Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Theresa Brown and Dr. Danielle Ofri. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for some introductions. Theresa Brown is a best-selling author and writer who lives in Pittsburgh. A former oncology and hospice nurse, her new book, Healing: When a Nurse Becomes a Patient, explores her diagnosis of and treatment for breast cancer in the context of her own nursing work. Ms. Brown has been a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and her writing has appeared on CNN.com and in the American Journal of Nursing, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She has been a guest on MSNBC Live and NPR's Fresh Air. Her first book, Critical Care: A New Nurse Faces Death, Life, and Everything in Between, chronicles her initial year of nursing and has been adopted as a textbook in schools of nursing across the country. Her second book, The Shift: One Nurse, 12 Hours, 4 Patients' Lives, was a New York Times bestseller. Dr. Danielle Ofri is a primary care internist at Bellevue Hospital and clinical professor of medicine at New York University. She is one of the foremost voices in the medical world today, shining an unflinching light on the realities of healthcare and speaking passionately about the doctor-patient relationship. Dr. Ofri is editor-in-chief of the Bellevue Literary Review, the first literary journal to arise from a medical setting, and her writing appears in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Lancet, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Her newest book is When We Do Harm: A Doctor Confronts Medical Error. And now my pleasure to introduce Theresa Brown and Danielle Ofri.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am so happy that you're all joining us tonight. I apologize in advance for my slightly croaky voice getting over laryngitis, but I'm so delighted to introduce Theresa Brown and her wonderful new book, Healing: When a Nurse Becomes a Patient. And I wanted to start the conversation to talk about nursing before we get to the book. And nursing is one of those complicated fields. It's ranked number 1 for the most trusted professions for 20 years straight. That's amazing. But when you ask people, so many say, I would never want to become a nurse. Can you speak to that tension and then maybe tell us how and why you became a nurse?
Yes, and thanks for the great introduction. And also, I am also getting over laryngitis. So Danielle and I were joking over email beforehand.
Cheers.
That we'll, sound like these two croaky women. And I'm also sucking on a cough lozenge so I don't cough. So I'm not chewing gum. But to get to the reason why we're here, I call this the $1 million question, because most people acted like you'd have to pay me $1 million to get me to give up being a college professor to become a nurse. And one person said to me, did you just hate having the summers off? Which kind of did make me think, what am I doing? But the true version is my dad was a professor at Missouri State University and in philosophy. Growing up, I thought, that looks like the greatest job in the world. You get to hang out with students, think about ideas, be with books. Seemed wonderful. So I got my Ph.D., became a professor, and it is a great job. But for me, it was not the greatest job in the world. It didn't have that spark that I wanted a job to have for me. So then I just spent 6 years getting a Ph.D., and it's a little unsettling to think, well, now what am I going to do? Into that gap came my children, my son, and then 2.5 years later, I had twin daughters. And it was the twin pregnancy and then the first year with the twins and my son, lots of chaos, didn't sleep, but there was so much joy and love and caregiving and attention. And I found this whole part of myself that was not about books and ideas, although I love books and ideas, but was about people and being with them and seeing what's going on with them and taking care of them. So then a friend of mine visited when the twins were about 16 months old. She's a nurse. And I was telling her, I thought the midwives who took care of me had the coolest job in the world. This is the bar, right, that I'm setting. And she looked at me and she said, Theresa, you could do that job. And it had never crossed my mind. I thought that you could only become a nurse if you'd been the kind of person who bandaged your dolls when you were little and read biographies of Florence Nightingale. And I hadn't done any of that stuff. Then I found out those are not actually the requirements for nursing school. And I looked into it more and was sold. A month later, literally, I was taking college chemistry because now I had to go back to school, take all the science classes I had never taken. And what attracted me to it, to get to the harder part of your question, Danielle, is being in that in-between space. There's the patient and there's the physician and sort of the whole healthcare system. And the nurse is the one who's bridging the patient with all those different entities. And I really love that. The truth is, though, I actually knew very little about bedside nursing when I started this path. And I thought, I'm going to get my master's degree, I'm going to be a midwife. But then the more I learned about bedside nursing, the more I fell in love with it, that role. And it's not respected often the way it should be, but it's incredibly important. And I gave up this idea of getting a master's. I wanted to stay at the bedside, all of which still puzzles people, but that's the place where I was happiest and felt like this is a really great job for me.
All right, so let's oncology and hospice, two of the most terrifying words anyone can ever hear. How did you end up there?
Yeah, well, the oncology, I talk about this in the book. I have a lot of cancer in my mom's family. And I thought, well, I've always been frightened of cancer, but also interested in it, and started in oncology. It was about 2 or 3 years into the job that by this time I was writing about nursing and healthcare, and I was going to give a talk. I was sitting on the plane thinking about, why did I do oncology? Suddenly remembered that my mom, not remembered, that's not quite the right word, but it popped into my active thinking that my mom had hairy cell leukemia. This was over a decade ago, and she had been successfully treated. But I had taken that memory and packed it away, and then it just unwrapped. And I understood that I wanted to give back to the institution that had helped her and healed her. And hospice, it's more complicated. I ended up seeing a lot of what I would call bad deaths in oncology. I worked in bone marrow transplant, so really sick people, really difficult diseases, really challenging treatments. And I just saw a lot of bad deaths and felt the moral distress of that and wanted to see people die better, which might sound macabre or weird, but doing hospice work it's so enriching. I always said what's good about it and what's hard about it are this close. And I found it just incredibly rewarding and a privilege to be with people at this point in their lives. So I left sort of leaving one thing, trying to find something better, and found this just amazing world of compassion and looking out for people and helping them and their families at this very crucial time.
You know, whenever I refer patients for hospice, they're always resistant. They never want to hear of it, do it. The minute they start, they're like, how come you didn't send me here sooner? How come I didn't do this? Because it turns out to be literally the best experience. And I know it's so hard to explain to people, but everyone who ends up in a hospice, either home hospice or inpatient, says, I wish you had done this a year ago. But let's talk about the book. So Healing is a beautiful book. And usually I start these book talks with, how did the book come to be? But instead I thought maybe I'd ask you to read just the first 2 pages of the prologue that can kind of set the scene of how the book came to be.
That sounds good. I was reading Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay the day I went for my scan. The inside cover of the book is neon pink, not the girlish pink of Disney princesses and bubblegum, but a knowing, winking pink, the color of a bad, as in badass feminist, the kind of person who reads Bad Feminist while waiting for a mammogram. It was a follow-up. I had mentioned it to my husband, who was out of town, but no one else. I always got called back. Well, not always, but often. And I'd sweated the quote, need for additional screening enough times that I had convinced myself there's no value to being anxious in advance. I had a mammogram and an ultrasound, right side only. I waited calmly in the hallway in between the two scans, and then I waited in the ultrasound room after the tech left and before the radiologist came in. I might have wondered why the tech left, but instead I read my neon pink book word by word without knowing what I was reading. A questionable scan merits an on-the-spot reading by an on-site radiologist who came in and redid the ultrasound. She took a long time, which annoyed me. And then, once I considered why she might be slow, scared me. Finally, she said, "I see a mass." A mass. I saw her in profile, gray hair pulled back from her face, her eyes focused on the screen. It might seem like she could have said more, but those 4 words were already too many. I didn't move, speak, or sit up, but I did begin to cry slowly. Tears dribbled out of each eye and slid down the sides of my face as I lay silent on the exam table. I'm a former oncology nurse and a hospice nurse. I knew the importance of letting the doctor finish the scan, that panicking wouldn't help me or her as she took final measurements or did whatever she had to do. I figured I was knowledgeable enough about having cancer because I knew about specific cancers, that I understood cancer patients' feelings because I'd cared for so many, that I'd confronted mortality because I'd had a number of patients die. But I was wrong. Other people's mortality is categorically different from one's own. Actual mortality, which is to say mine, had never before this moment seemed real. Could it be a fibroid adenoma? I blurted out. I'd had those before and they're not cancerous. No, she said, gently shaking her head. This looks ugly. She left, and as soon as I heard the door latch, I sat up and sobbed, my whole body shaking. Fear had found me and everything seemed upside down. My nurse self had abandoned me and I had become a patient, not just any kind of patient either, but a cancer patient.
Thank you. That's really touching. And I'd like to talk a little bit about disease versus illness, right? We talk about cancer. That's a big term. There's a lot of diseases there, but everyone's illness is different. And also to bring up, just the range of cancer. There's the pea in the breast type of cancer, and there's the metastatic pancreatic cancer. They're not all the same, as you well know, and you talk about in the book. How do you wrestle with those different sort of swirls of currents around you?
That is a great question, the difference between disease and illness. Because I think I used both interchangeably, thinking about myself, but the disease was really the cancer, the diagnosis, the clinical details, and the illness was for me that, but also how I felt about it and how it was affecting my life. So illness was kind of a penumbra around disease. But I'm remembering this incident I had with a patient that has always stuck with me. I said something once about your disease, and she said, "Don't say that. Don't use the word disease," which was really interesting. And I didn't ask her why, because it didn't seem appropriate, even though I was curious. And of course, I didn't do it anymore. But yeah, cancer has so many burdens that are placed on it, right? It's a gift, it's a journey, it's a this, it's a that. And I had the pea-sized tumor in my breast. That's the most common kind of breast cancer that's very treatable. And yet I was mortally afraid of dying. And right then, someone who has metastatic pancreatic cancer often has literally just weeks to live. And yet we still have this one word to talk about all those different diagnoses. And I guess you get cancer and then you put the word metastatic on it. But when you're first diagnosed, you don't know if you're metastatic or not. And that's terrifying. And I remember for me, I could only completely relax once I found out it wasn't in the lymph nodes, there was no spread.
I think that we in the medical profession, we use the term disease a lot, but I think the patients are experiencing the illness.
Yes.
And you can't make the assumption of what they'll, your disease, what you're right. What does that mean? It's that person's experience, and whether it's the P in the breast or the metastatic adenocarcinoma, and so I guess that segues to my next question. So what what did you not understand in all your years as a nurse that you finally learned once you were a patient?
I did not understand that penumbra of illness. I only understood cancer as a disease. I knew people had feelings about it. I knew intellectually that they were afraid. I knew it brought up all kinds of issues. I knew it complicated family life. I knew all of that, but I had never clearly understood how life-changing a cancer diagnosis is, and that suddenly you're a patient with an illness, and that illness could affect the course of your entire life. And I mean, the thing we're all worried about, right, is shorten it. That's the real anxiety. So that is such a great phrasing. Yeah, I knew my patients were sick and had disease, but I don't think I'd seen them as being ill with this whole emotional context around their physical problem.
And I think once we're patients, we see, like I think as healthcare workers, we see the disease as the most important thing. But for the patients, there are many things that are important. I remember when I had my first baby, I was in the hospital. One of the tortures of modern obstetrics is they withhold food and water until you produce a baby. So by the time you get to postpartum, I remember they plopped down this frosty pitcher of ice water, and it was just out of reach. And you can't just hop up postpartum to grab it. And I couldn't reach it. And I remember my world got smaller and smaller. At that point, I didn't care who's having a cardiac arrest. That pitcher of water was the most important thing. And I didn't care who was dying. And I realized now that was so absurd. It was just water. But at that moment, when you have that need, and so now when I see patients, like I move their tissues and their water and the phone, everything close by, because you forget when you're outside, what it is that matters, and you just don't know. I think till you're there, and there are so many trade-offs in medical care, and we have this odd thing that we call side effects, right?
Yes,
things that we in the medical profession, it isn't the aim of our treatment. But for the patient, it's all effects, the good and the bad, we get them all. I mean, we downgrade them because we're not the ones that we want, but for the patients, the distinction is really meaningless. And I was wondering if you could read the opening of chapter 27, which is called On the Side, because it's a beautiful, on page 163, sort of what are side effects from the perspective of a patient?
Yeah, and I should explain this. A lot of the titles they resonate in different ways. So there's a section of the book that says out of the frying pan. And then this on the side is also meant to play on that very idea that Danielle was just getting at, that we just call them side effects. Like, oh, it's just the side, it's on the side, it's your coleslaw, but it's not actually. Okay. Consider one hospital patient back when I worked on the bone marrow transplant floor. I went into his room to administer scheduled chemotherapy, and he asked a simple question: will this make my neuropathy worse? Will this make the tingling, numbness, and pain in my feet worse? He wanted to know. The answer was maybe. About 30 to 40% of patients who receive chemo get peripheral neuropathy in their hands and or feet, which neuropathy means nerve damage. The problem is common enough that it has its own acronym, CIPN, for chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. Certain drugs cause it, but not for everyone, and certain drugs don't. Whether a person already has neuropathies, from diabetes, for example, can factor hugely into whether chemo makes them worse. With this patient, I split the difference. It can cause neuropathy, I said, giving an answer pretty much guaranteed to satisfy no one. He got mad so quickly that it surprised me. Well, that's going to make the neuropathy even worse, he spit out. Some leukemia patients had such intense neuropathy in their feet that they could barely walk, either because the pain couldn't be managed or because they no longer felt their feet well enough to balance. This is normal, and it's a terrible devil's bargain too. This patient was the first to crack my clinical ethical certainties, my surety that we hurt people for their own good, that the trade-off was worth it because we saved their lives. Of course. But in the meantime, his feet hurt and walking was hard, and we did that to him. We cured him and we crippled him. Not a metaphor, but a fact.
And I think that speaks to, his illness includes the neuropathy. We think of the disease, the cancer, we got it, woohoo. Yes. But, he still has to live with all the effects, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We sometimes talk about in medicine, the difficult patient, the compliant or the adherent patient. What kind of patient were you?
Yeah, I started out trying to be the easy patient. And there was something that happened right away I did get angry about, but I was trying to be the easy patient, which is the go along, get along patient. You do what you're told, you do it when you're told, not before, you don't complain. Because I knew from being a nurse that healthcare is now so much like a giant assembly line, especially in the hospital. And well, actually, I wasn't in the hospital, but that's where I'd worked, right? And I was getting my procedures and tests done in a hospital. So no one in that system likes the person who says, whoa, let's put on the brake here. I don't get what's going on, because that doesn't just mess up your assembly line, it messes up a whole bunch of other assembly lines too. And nobody wants that because everybody's overworked, everybody's too busy. They want things to just go the way they're supposed to go. So I was trying to do that because I thought that's what I need to do. And over time, I realized that just was not working for me. It made me feel like I wasn't a human being and that I didn't have any choice or agency. And so I started to ask questions and say, why does this have to be so delayed? Why can't this happen sooner? And I had a moment of realization where I said, oh my God, I am the difficult patient. And it was so embarrassing, really, because I hate to admit I have used that label, but maybe one or two times I have. And suddenly I saw myself and I realized what I was doing was completely appropriate and adult. I wasn't yelling at people. I wasn't threatening them. I was just saying, come on, why do I have to wait like this? Can't you give me my test result in 2 days instead of a week? Seems very basic and like you're not asking that much, right? So I now have transitioned into the difficult patient. And I will always point out things when I think there are issues and try to do it very appropriately, basically because I think this is the only way we're going to get change. I'm hoping for a bottom-up revolution of, and Danielle, I know from your writing, you spend tons of time with your patients, you're listening to them, talking to them. And I think every clinician wants to be able to do that without saying, oh my gosh, I'm taking too much time. Oh my gosh, I only have 15 minutes. Oh my gosh, other people are going to be waiting and they're going to be mad. We need a reorientation that's about looking at patients as people instead of just something that gets categorized as throughput.
I mean, it's hard. I mean, I just came from clinic and every one of my patients showed up today. And so I didn't have any gaps. And I found myself getting annoyed when they brought up, oh, I'm trying to get the CD for my MRI or this form. Can you call the social worker for me? I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't call the social worker. But, for each person, this is the most important thing. When you think about it being this drama, this is the peak climax of someone's drama when they're feeling, Anatoly Broyard wrote in his book, for the doctor, I'm just one patient amongst his rounds. But for me, it's the crisis of my life. And I have to stop and remind myself that my patient may have waited 5 months for this appointment. They've saved up their 50 questions. Wow. They've brought in their mother and their spouse. And, even from like, oh my God, I have 6 patients waiting. And, but of course, when you're the patient, you see it really differently. This is your prime moment. Let's talk a little bit about hospitals because you brought it up a lot. Now, walking into a hospital, I think scares the crap out of most people, as it should, and if you're not from the medical profession and you end up in a hospital, it's kind of like landing on Mars, this completely alien landscape, weird social interactions, strange language, but for us, it's totally comfortable. We're used to speaking, right, in jargon and we know everyone's the different white coats, a different kind of stethoscope. We can, suss out who's who. It's so comfortable that we don't even notice that it's such a bizarre place. And so I'm curious, when you came in as a patient, what did you notice about hospitals just as a hive? What did you see?
What a great question. Yeah, there's always all these people going places, and I had no idea where they were going or what was so important. And part of me felt that pull. I want to be with them. I want to be going places that are important too. And part of me felt so alienated from it. And for my radiation oncology, they let me sit out in the hallway to wait for my appointments because the TV was playing game shows, and I'm not sure why, but that made me really anxious. So they said, you can sit out in the hallway. So I had this great view of all the people going into the OBGYN department. And that was really a good picture of the two different worlds, because there would be people in scrubs going by or people in suits going by and having intense talks with other people in suits, or maybe one person in a white coat and they have clipboards and this and that and the other thing. And sometimes people doing house cleaning would come by. And then I saw this unending stream of, one very pregnant woman coming in with an attentive partner with his arm around her, and another very pregnant woman with a baby in a stroller, and such a contrast between the patients I was seeing and this slice of human life and the go, we're all in costume aspect of hospital care.
Yeah, one thing I remember noticing is sometimes at the nurse's station, people laugh, they're on the phone, and from the patient or especially the family's perspective, it must sound so awful to hear people laughing. But, staff is human, and they have their days and their good days and bad days, and they might be chatting in between doing their stuff. And, we can see how that makes sense in their day. But, when it's someone else, and I remember when my daughter had appendicitis, the troop of people coming in and out, it was like the population of a small city. And everyone wore scrubs. I mean, I'm telling you, the senior surgical attending and the housekeeper looked identical. I couldn't tell who was who unless I could read. Wow. They're all wearing scrubs. I'm like, come on, guys, can we do something about this? Because from a patient's perspective, they're all look like the same. So it was just very strange. And the fact that they didn't let you sleep, or whatever it was so important. And of course, I remember when I would round, when I finally got to the patient, I don't have time to come back. So this is our moment. But, from the patient's perspective, like I finally got some sleep, and all of a sudden, time to wake up to get your blood pressure, to get a medication. It was really and in fact, when you mentioned the radonc section, I wouldn't mind actually if you read that little section, because what I thought it really brought out is the issue of the little things. And when I talked about getting that pitcher of water, I knew intellectually that didn't matter compared to taking care of my health or the health of the patient in the next bed over. But from my experience of being a patient, that seemed to matter so much more, something I never really understood. And if you could read that and sort of help us understand why these things that seem almost irrelevant take on outsized importance when you're the patient.
Yeah. So, and I typed this up just to make it flow because an excerpt from the chapter. Sorry, I feel fine. I just, yes, exactly. It's one word and the A is long, onc. If you want to sound in the know, this is what you say for radiation oncology. My treatment began the Monday after Thanksgiving. I would go 5 days a week for 4 weeks and be done by Christmas. My first appointment took place after Thanksgiving. The radiologist came across as frank and caring. She stressed how important it was not to miss any days of treatment. Afterwards, a nurse talked to me about taking care of my skin. And I'm just going to interject in here. They gave every patient a large container of aloe vera gel to take care of their, sorry, I'm pointing where my scar is, to take care of their skin. I'm allergic to aloe vera. She was so apologetic that they had no Aquaphor lotion to give me. I mean, I could tell she just felt terrible. Like she had really let me down. So unusual. And you can buy Aquaphor at the drugstore, right? It's not a big deal, but the feeling that went into it was amazing. Before I left Onc that first day, they gave me an iPad to watch a video that showed what would happen during my treatments. As I recall, the video was straightforward, kind of boring even, but reassuring. It made radiation therapy seem almost ordinary, and the large machines looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Not a scary movie, but a movie where everything more or less turns out okay in the end. After I met the doctor and the nurse and watched the video, I had another separate appointment where a technician took the measurements needed for my treatments. Then she showed me the specially made shirts that radiology patients get for radiation therapy. Volunteers make them, she said proudly, as I looked at a rack of singularly hideously patterned short-sleeve shirts decorated with neon pentagrams inside dull pink squares and large avocado and cerise-colored flowers on backgrounds of dull brown. Imagine that Maria, the singing governess from The Sound of Music, found some really ugly drapes to use to sew shirts for cancer patients instead of the lively flower prints from which she made clothing for the Von Trapp children. No one would sing Do Re Mi in a field of alpine flowers in one of those shirts. I looked through them, each one uglier than the one before, and I loved them. First, they fastened with Velcro, and the Velcro made the shirts special. Velcro connected the two front and side pieces of the shirt, making it easy to expose one breast for treatment and then put the shirt back together when treatment was done. I also liked how aggressively garish and dated the patterns on the shirts were, the opposite of the bland gowns patients usually wear. The shirts had a name too, a good one, dignity robes. Dignity, intrinsic worth, also gravity and poise. Can a shirt do all that? In this case, yes, because the shirt was all of a piece with the clinic. At Onc, they cared. So bring on the dignity robes with their pseudo-psychedelic patterns on thick mud brown cloth. Bring on the video, which has gotten mixed up in my mind with the videos they show on airplanes before takeoff. Here are the safety features of our airplane versus here are the cancer-fighting features of radiation oncology. Nothing can make a cancer diagnosis better. There is bad and worse. There's also terrible and there's tragic. What I wanted and what I got in radiation oncology was the feeling that people cared enough to make treatment easier, right down to letting me sit in the hallway outside the waiting room because watching snippets of game shows on the waiting room TV made me anxious. 5 days a week for 4 weeks, a friendly technician stepped out into the hallway and called me in for each of my appointments without ever implying that I was putting them out. Forgetfulness hit me like an extra symptom of cancer once I was diagnosed. Trauma theorists assert that forgetting and rearranging memories are common for trauma victims. Did having cancer make me a trauma victim? Me with my stage 1 found on ultrasound breast cancer? Well, of course. What a surprise then that I actually have some pretty great memories from radonc. And despite the large, pricey machines and the sci-fi vibe of the place, it was old-fashioned concern and basic politeness that made my radiation treatments feel better than other aspects of my cancer care. So here's my question. If they can be compassionate at radiation oncology, why can't they be that way everywhere else?
It reminds me, when we talk to our students, healthcare is really hard. It's hard to be a nurse. It's hard to be a doctor. It's hard to be anything because there's 50 times more things you need to do than you have time for. But it only takes a couple of words to make the patient feel better, despite the frustrations. And we had a clerk on 16 West at Bellevue. He was just the clerk. He had, very limited education, but his goal was to say, hello, how are you, and welcome in every language that our patient spoke. And he could do it in about 25 languages. So whatever the patient came up in, he would be able to welcome them. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Bengali, Yiddish he had, Russian, he had it down. And it was just his little effort. And you would not believe, because for patients who don't speak English and rely on interpreters, it's really hard. You're very lonely. And just that greeting in your language from this Puerto Rican clerk was an amazing touch. And it doesn't take that much. So, if you are a student or a healthcare worker, even the smallest thing, hey, how's it going? Do you need another blanket? It can mean the world to a patient, even if you can't solve anything else, of their problems.
Right.
So I want to go ahead.
Yeah. Are you thirsty for your situation? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Indeed. So I want to pull back from the book a second to talk about COVID, because we can't do anything without COVID. And I think that most people in the world are pretty happy to ignore the healthcare system when they don't need it, and which is as it should be. Mm-hmm. But in March and April of 2020, suddenly everyone was watching us. Everyone was talking about pulse ox readings and ventilators and high flow oxygen. Everyone was an armchair epidemiologist. Remember that? Uh-huh. How do you think COVID affected how the public viewed the healthcare system?
At first, it seemed very positive. And one thing that I really liked was that nurses got a lot of attention. There was a study done a few years ago that found basically since the 70s to now, nurses are in about 2 to 4% of all journalistic stories about healthcare, which is a really small number. So suddenly nurses were getting a lot more attention, and that was good. And we had the whole everyone in healthcare as heroes. And then it seemed like people kind of lost their focus and they started to get angry. People who did not think we needed a vaccine or didn't trust the vaccines, didn't believe that COVID was a serious illness, started to get really angry at healthcare workers. And I know there were healthcare workers who felt besieged. I know there were healthcare workers who felt like, don't call me a hero and don't buy me pizza, give me enough staff to work with, let me take a break, pay me more. So I think we gained some things that people got a better sense of how healthcare actually works, which is it's not just, despite what Grey's Anatomy shows you, it's not just a group of physicians who are all friends with each other, like hanging out in the hallway, waiting till you have a problem. That's
right,
actually
really well-coiffed hair and really good looking.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well rested.
Yeah. That work is usually done by nurses. Just because doctors they're not in the hospital 24/7 because they're taking care of patients in other settings. So I think people got a better sense of how healthcare works. The whole idea of what it means to have a team, especially in the ICU, and that there are priests and rabbis and social workers and, people we don't ever even think about really and give credit to for healthcare. but also it seems like some of the bloom came off the rose in a way that there's more cynicism. And I think of all these people who didn't go in for appointments they needed. And when they did finally come in, their cancers were more serious. Their diabetes had gotten out of control. And I worry that there was trust that got lost with all the arguing about vaccines and COVID, but maybe also just the whole way the pandemic played out. And I feel like this is the perfect moment for a reset, a reorientation, to really look at healthcare and say, how could we make this about human beings? And I wrote my book as a patient, but also what we saw during COVID was so little attention was given to people doing the work as human beings. And that really, really needs to change. So many nurses have left. The physician suicide rate, as you know, Danielle, is just disturbingly high. And I actually found out for nurses who are women, it's also very high, not for nurses who are men. They think because women go home and then have a lot of family responsibilities. That's a speculation. I don't think, from what I read, no one knows exactly why that is. But so we've really got to focus on our clinicians and taking care of them, because if we don't have doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists, we don't have healthcare.
Yeah, I have to say, I was a little surprised by this shift. I mean, the hero worship in the beginning felt a little over the top. I mean, it felt a little awkward, although I must say the 7 p.m. cheer was the most inspiring thing. At first I thought, oh, it's so corny, but to either hear it or to participate in it, if I wasn't on, I was out there smashing my pots and pans every night to like see my neighbors all out there. There was something, it was so inspiring. But I did not expect the turn. I did not expect the public to kind of take it out on the messenger. I really, and we have a prison ward at Bellevue. We take care of the prisoners from Rikers. And this is a lot of patients who have a lot of issues, and, there can be a lot of anger against the corrections staff, but not toward their doctors. It always seemed like we're the one people that they seem to respect because we were there to take care of them and not to be at all involved in the criminal justice part. And I sort of thought that same thing would stay with COVID, that all the stuff politically can come and go, but the doctors and nurses, we're still doing the same thing. None of us are getting paid more for this or anything. And I didn't expect to see protests outside of hospitals or healthcare workers to be harangued on the way out the door. I have to say I was disappointed in that, because it was still the same people, many of whom were working double shifts, and many of whom came from communities that were really hit hard by COVID. And they, and many of whom got sick, and there's just something to think about. And I'm wondering how you think COVID changed the nursing profession.
Wow, that's a big, hard question. So if people listening don't know this, a lot of nurses quit bedside work. Some found other kinds of nursing work, and some are just not being nurses anymore. And what I hear anecdotally is places are trying to hire now and they just can't find nurses. So one of the problems is a lot of nurses left their jobs to become travel nurses that could make 3 to 5 times what they were making. And there were even nurses who became travel nurses and then came back to the job they had as a travel nurse. So they're now in their old job, making 3 to 5 times what they were, working with the same people. And hospitals started to really complain about this. We can't afford these labor costs. And in a couple of states, they even proposed legislation to cap nurses' salaries, which, nurses were furious. Like, what about healthcare CEO salaries, for example? So I think what nurses, in a kind of perverse way, learned is we can push back against that sense that we're expendable. A lot of nurses found if they were making enough money, they could handle the really hard job situation a lot better than they could have when they were making less money. But again, I'm hoping for a reset where we really prepare nurses to have agency and autonomy as healthcare providers. People in nursing like to think, oh, we're done with this model that the doctor's on top and the nurse is just there as a kind of servant. And I think in a lot of ways we are, but in a lot of ways we aren't. And I would love it if nursing would take this moment to embrace, hey, we're colleagues with physicians, we're on the same team, and then think about how do we become real solid professionals, and what would it take for the healthcare system to give us for that to be true. And it may sound like a pie in the sky dream, but why not dream big? We're at a moment where it's time to really think about, hey, we could make our healthcare system better in so many ways, and we need to.
All right. Well, I'm going to switch gears one more time.
Okay.
And many of the audience here, you know Theresa as a writer and a nurse. You may know her op-ed pieces in the Times, her previous bestseller, The Shift, but you may not know that she is a reviewer for the Bellevue Literary Review. And this is our journal where we publish fiction, poetry, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And Theresa's one of our reviewers. And so, Theresa, I want to ask you about the role of literature, both the reading of it and the writing of it when it comes to healing.
I think it's so important. And that medical humanities, which a few of us are trying to get going here in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, and we're not having so much luck so far. But literature just gives you entree into seeing a problem from such a human perspective, which is what I tried to do in healing. But this is the thing. I always talk about Hamlet, and I sat through English classes where, why does Hamlet delay? And I've read Hamlet several times. It's one of my favorite plays. And I started to realize, Hamlet's depressed. He talks like someone who's depressed. He's always wearing black. And that's why he delays, because he's depressed. And I love it that now I have this new take on this play, right? But it actually helps me see depression in a different way, sort of see someone who's trying to navigate the death of his father and his mother's remarriage to his uncle, which happened in his view much too quickly, and this feeling of abandonment. And now the ghost of his father has come back and said, you need to go kill your uncle because your uncle actually poisoned me. And he's already depressed and he can't take any action, and he's trying to find happiness and he doesn't know how to do that. I think it's just a great portrayal of that situation, and that literature can give us that. It can show us that illness penumbra, right? In a way that just a case study or reading in a textbook can't do. And that I love the BLR. I love reading all these submissions, some fiction, some nonfiction, but all trying to grapple with the human side of illness, which is so important to understand.
So I know we're coming close to the top of the hour. I wanted to read one just quote here. You said, it would not be lying to say that caregiving can feel like love, even when the two people are strangers, even when, or maybe especially because one of them is dying. And could you talk a little bit about love in healthcare?
Yeah, I think I felt that a lot, especially once I got into hospice. And that I was writing about a patient who, on paper, this guy and I have nothing in common. He was a big rider of a Harley Davidson motorcycle, which, maybe I would like. I just never have done that. Loved Clint Eastwood movies. I can like a good Clint Eastwood movie, but, our lives were very different. But somehow we really connected, and I felt a lot of affection for him and for his wife, who was working so hard and taking amazing care of him. And I really like talking about that as love and bringing in the word love, because it also says something about how I feel, right? It's like it's a relationship then. You know, I can say I'm compassionate, I care about you. But when you extend that to this feeling of, wow, I'm really putting my heart into this, and I feel that connection, that heart to heart connection with you, that's what I was trying to get at. And I would feel that feeling a lot for certain patients. And, you know, the ones in the book are the ones I felt that about the most. I say the last patient I saw in hospice before I was diagnosed was an older woman who was dying of metastatic breast cancer, also an omen. But there was something about her spirit. And she told me, you know, I'm gonna get through this. I've got grandchildren. And usually in hospice, we're very truthful. This time I thought about it and I said, yeah, why not? You know, I really fudged in a way I normally wouldn't, not to give her hope or whatever, but because it seemed like that was part of the moment. You know, who knows if she really thought she was going to survive her metastatic disease. It doesn't matter, right? And it's not for me to point that out to her in a painful way, although I could have done it gently. But in that moment, there would be no value to that. So much more value to connecting with her as a human being. And I'll never forget her there in her pink pajamas. She had this beautiful white hair brushed back from her face. Just a very striking person. I had a very strong positive feeling for.
That was beautiful. So last question, what's next for you?
Yeah, well, I keep saying I have another moment where I have to decide what I want to be when I grow up. And I think I'm going to be a writer. So I have to figure out what's the next book. But also in August, I'd always wanted to take a safari in Africa. And so we're taking I had cancer, let's save our money and take a safari in Africa. And I'm really excited about that and very glad that I bit the bullet and said, hey, let's make this happen.
Well, good for you. That is a great way to cap out the year. And I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Theresa, for this beautiful book, and turn it back over to Lonnie.
What an excellent interview. Danielle, you did such a lovely job. I love how you just move through the text. I love that I don't think Theresa's probably that great of an actress that she is pretending that she appreciated the interesting angle that you were taking, and that it was you gave her some questions. My guess is maybe on the book tour she hasn't yet encountered and that she valued. So very much appreciated a really skillful interview. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
And so we have a couple questions. I want to first of all remind everyone that we are going to be doing after hours with Theresa. We're probably going to go a little bit lighter on her tonight, maybe cut her loose a little bit early. As you can hear, she is struggling with her voice, and she probably has, I'm sure, more book tour events to do as well. But she will join us. We're going to give her a 5-minute break in between this and after hours. How do you get to after hours? Buy a copy of this fabulous book through our bookseller. We've been putting the links in chat, so grab it. You'll get a link from the bookstall in an email that will let you register for after hours, and we'd love to welcome you. We'll open that room at about 8:05 Central. All right, so a quick question here. Let's start with a question from Robin, who's on the Zoom. She says, the question of why can't every department be like Radonc? Great question. Do you have some ideas about how to spread that to other places in the hospital? It sounds like they were in the moment, not focused on the quote to-do list in their heads, meeting the patient human to human, similar to mindfulness. Are there ways to encourage that in organizations?
Yeah, it has to start with leadership. That's really what it comes down to. And I believe there was somebody in Radonc who made that really important, because the techs who saw me every day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks, every single time it was, hey, Theresa, how you doing? I rode my bike. They talked to me about that. And they were that way with everyone. It wasn't just with me. And one of them one day told me, we know that you don't want to be here, so we have to be extra nice. When I thought about that later, I realized that must have come from somebody running that department, because the whole department was like that. And it really takes the focus of leadership to highlight that. And as Danielle said, and why I love the radonc example is because it wasn't anything hard, right? It's not like they had a chief compassion officer who came in and said, do this and do that. It was old-fashioned kindness, or Danielle talking about their clerk who learns how to say hello to everyone in their language. When my daughter had surgery, the transporter we had was just an amazing human being. And we ended up getting him several times when she was in the hospital. Now that's the luck of a person, right? Or Danielle's clerk. That's the luck of having that person. But just think if leadership emphasized that in a meaningful way and prioritize that as much as they prioritize, did you check this box? Did you get this done? Did you go through all these tasks? And are there some of those tasks and paperwork things that we could eliminate so people would have more focus and energy? It like sounds like a big job, but I don't think it has to be, but it does take commitment.
Mhm. Herm has a question here, and I know I'm pretty positive he'll be at after hours, so I'm going to
Nice.
maybe we can give a quick answer, but then probably maybe a bit more fuller answer. And he wants to know, do you delve into the economic component of medicine, insurance, et cetera, in the book? The politics behind medicine are very complicated, and I find it interesting and concerning that the US is one of the few advanced countries that does not have universal or free healthcare. The obvious counterpoint that is usually made is that the profit motive drives innovation. So wondering, I think what he's trying to get at is in the book, do you look at like, well, why is it this way? Why is healthcare delivered this way in the US? Now, I know the answer to that because I read the book, but maybe for others.
Right. Yes. A quick answer. I do some of that definitely. And I also talk about racial inequities that are still very present in healthcare.
Okay. And then Robin, let's finish up. We're at 7:59. So another quick question. When thinking about the tremendous strain and pressure on healthcare workers right now, are there programs or structural supports that you've seen help sustain people? What can we all do to help? That's a great way to end out as well.
Wow. I think there are a lot of local things. Maybe Danielle knows, I don't know of any big picture thing. I mean, one thing that's really important is there are a lot of nurses who wanted to have psychotherapy and then they found out their insurance wouldn't cover it. Their insurance they got through the hospital.
Wow.
So anyone who's working on equity between mental health care and physical care, however that's described, and I know there's going to be a big push for that in a month or so. That's sort of coming down the pike. But yeah, stressing mental health care, having that be available. And I do want to tell people, if you have a bad experience in your healthcare, do say something, but please try to make it a bigger complaint than I had this lazy nurse who, or I had this stupid doctor who, you know, unless someone's just grossly incompetent, but try to put it in terms of, my doctor just seemed really overworked. My nurse seemed like she had way too much to do on her plate. Try to make your complaint more of a system complaint, because the system often just blames individuals and that makes things easy for them, right? Oh,
Exactly.
it's just that lazy person, whatever.
Exactly.
If I can just add, if you have a great experience,
Yeah.
write that up too. You know, I think the CEOs rarely see, you know, they don't get a letter about the transporter who took the time to hold your hand because you were really nervous, you know, in the elevator. It's nice to get that. I think we so rarely ever hear the positive feedback, even though the patients, I think, will express that to us and say how much they enjoy it. They almost never make that known to the powers that be. So go ahead and write a 2-line letter or make a phone call.
Danielle, I appreciate that extra PS on there. I think that's advice well taken. So we are at 8:01. So we're going to close out the Zoom for everyone coming to after hours. Teresa's got a nice 5-minute break here. Yes, hold up the book one more time. The book is fabulous. Thank you everyone for coming. Danielle, Theresa, thank you so much. Great, great content. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.